You're a teenager who's an atheist? Well, you're just going through a phase. You'll grow out of it eventually and see the light in Christ. If you're an atheist watching this video, have you ever heard this phrase said to you? If you're a Christian watching this, have you ever said this to anyone? Chances are a great many of you have. AKA maybe like 10. I have literally no subscribers. By the way, subscribe. More videos will be coming out semi-regularly. But, back to the topic. You're just going through a phase is an incredibly common thing for Christians to say, especially for Christian parents to say to young atheists. And in my opinion, it's an incredibly insulting and dismissive phase that's born out of the idea that, teenagers, they are just hormonal, rebellious kids who obviously aren't capable of making responsible decisions or reaching sound conclusions. And, that's not true. But I kind of get why Christians would say this sort of thing. It seems to me like it's an automatic defense mechanism. See, it's a Christian's belief that their religion is obviously true, and so it's common sense to follow it, and those who don't are simply the other, the fools who have never known God and will meet a fate worse than death in the end. But that could never happen to their children because they raised them up in their same faith, so obviously they will come to the same conclusions as their parents. So when people come out as atheists in their teens or 20s, that contradicts the parents' previous preconceptions. So rather than rethinking their own beliefs, Christians will instead seek solace in the fact that their children are only going through a temporary phase and will eventually see the light. They don't even consider the very real possibility that their children will simply never return to Christianity. But this kind of thinking is simply faulty on every level imaginable. As I said before, the idea that young atheists are simply going through a phase relies on the assumption that teenagers are simply too young to be reasonably sure of anything. And that is ridiculous. Well, yes, teenagers' brains are still in the process of developing. That doesn't make them hormone-controlled idiots. Many of them are completely capable of making rational decisions. In fact, many teenagers actually have the advantage of being more open to the reception of new information, as opposed to older people who have been consistently shown to be more unwilling to change their minds if new information is presented to them. I also can't help but notice the remarkable double standard at play here. If I, or any other teenager from a Christian family, were talking about how sure they were that God existed and how they wanted to love and serve Him all their life in faithfulness, no Christian parent in their right mind would say that they were just going through a phase and would instead be praising them for their faith and encouraging them that they were, incredibly wise in their choices, even though it is completely possible that that child would not remain that way for the rest of his or her life and could very easily grow out of their conviction to Jesus Christ as just a phase. So for any Christian parent with an atheist child watching this, your statement that they are simply going through a phase is a completely ridiculous self-delusion that speaks more to you trying to preserve your aspirations for your child than anything concurrent with reality. On top of that, the thinking of young atheists as just going through a phase also makes the assumption that when you become an adult, you are automatically just, more wise, and it's inevitable that you will come to the right conclusions on things. But this is also false, due to the fact that there are millions of adults in the United States that believe all kinds of ridiculous nonsense, like the fact that the Earth is flat, and that evolution and climate change are not real, and that the world is controlled by the Illuminati, that the aliens live among us, or that the Bible was inspired by the creator of the universe. But in order to see if I'm really just going through a phase and I will likely become a Christian again, one simply has to look at the actual data. It's a well-known phenomenon that the percentage of non-religious people has been rising in developed nations, and even though the United States has significantly more religious people than other developed countries like Japan and those in Europe, the religiously affiliated in the United States has still been declining for several decades, and that decline has rapidly sped up in recent years. According to a 2014 Pew Research study, the nones, meaning people who do not identify with any particular religion, made up 23% of the United States population. The percentage was only 16 in 2007. See, while religious institutions will tell all these stories about people who drifted away from the church but were rescued and found Jesus and their lives were made so much better by Christianity, they also completely ignore the millions of other people in the U.S. who leave the church and don't come back because they simply don't feel as though the doctrine of Christianity has made any reasonable bearing on their lives. When you take into account the fact that non-religious people have less children on average than religious people, it can be deduced by this rapid rise in secularism being observed in the United States and other formerly Christian-majority nations that is due to the massive sums of people who deconvert from Christianity and do not return to it. The rate of none to Christian converts is in every way less than Christian to none converts. It's been estimated that over 4 people become nuns for every 1 nun who becomes religiously affiliated every year.
What happens is they enter adulthood being less religious than their parents were. So there's a process of generational replacement where older people who are more religious die out, and they're replaced in the population by younger people coming up behind. And that's a process that's been happening for decades now across the Western world, in some cases for a century or more.
But to be honest, I'm not really representative of the majority of so-called nuns, as many of them don't even identify as atheist or agnostic. I didn't simply grow apart from the church because of apathy or disagreement with doctrine. I actually made an academic effort to logically come to the conclusion that I did with a rigorous study of the facts. I didn't rely on feelings to come to my conclusion. Not only that, but despite my absolute pitiful view count on this channel so far, I'm still making an effort to make my views about atheism be known to others. So technically, I am an activist for atheism. So what about other people like me who, studied the claims of religions and came to the conclusion that they were all false and now advocate against religion? Are they more likely to see the error of their ways and return to Christianity? Well, no, it's actually the opposite. And from what I could find, there aren't really that many cases of atheist community activists who come to their position based on logical reasoning and then went back on that position. And in many of those cases, former atheists merely consented that it might be possible that God exists, or that it is more likely than not that a God created the universe, not professing any kind of, fervent conviction to Christian doctrine. But yes, there are so-called militant atheists who have changed their mind. However, that fact is offset by the fact that, an extremely large portion of atheist activists are former Christians themselves, many of whom formerly believed in the gospel message and tried to spread it to others. Examples include Thomas Westbrook, a former youth pastor and Christian missionary, Drew McCoy, a former fundamentalist Christian and church group leader, Matt Dillahunty, a former fundamentalist Baptist, Seth Andrews, a Christian radio broadcaster for over a decade, Jimmy Snow, a former Mormon missionary, Aaron, a former Christian raised in Mormonism, Ali, a former Baptist, and Owen Morgan, a former Jehovah's Witness.
I could go on, but I think I've made my point.
Of course, many of these people made the transition from Christian to atheist as adults, but that just proves that atheism is not just some dumb teenage phase. Of course, I, like most atheists, are open to changing our position if new compelling evidence is presented to the contrary of the evidence we already have, and of course we can't disprove the existence of God, but here's the thing. Christians aren't arguing for the belief in a God. They are instead arguing for the belief in a very specific God, the Abrahamic God named Yahweh or Jehovah or Allah, and that God has had hundreds of pages of supposedly sacred text written about him, as well as billions of people spreading his message, claiming to truly know his real character. So by doing research about the wealth of information and claims that are available for study, I have come to the very natural conclusion that the God of the Bible is pure fantasy, as are all the other invented gods with their own sacred texts and followers and apologetics. I don't criticize and disbelieve in the Bible because I don't understand it. I actually understand it quite well, and it's very obvious to me after reading the entire thing twice over that it had no divine inspiration whatsoever.
Then, when the argument is laid out, it turns out to be something incredibly old and rehashed, like the watchmaker argument, the Kalam cosmological argument, or even an argument from personal experience. Most atheists I know have not only considered those arguments before, but understand their weakness as well. It's beyond frustrating to hear the same argument so many times from those who think we've never heard them. The irony is that, not always but sometimes, the theists using those arguments have never even heard them criticized.
So now I guess this is where I'm supposed to end the video, refuting the claim that, I'm just going through a phase. However, I really want to pick apart this oh-so-common phrase and figure out what it really means. What does the word phase mean? Well, there are a few definitions, but it's, obvious that the definition meant by the phrase, you're just going through a phase, is the second definition that dictionary.com gives, a stage in a process of change or development. And in that sense of the definition, yeah, I might grow out of the phase I'm currently in. I've certainly gone through many phases throughout my own lifetime. Particularly when I was a kid, I was, constantly shifting from one interest to another. Like, for example, there were times when I was, super passionate about doing Legos, and then I sort of got bored of it and then moved on. But then later I went through another Lego phase and got really into it again. Or like with science, I was pretty much always into science, but I certainly went through phases with it. Like, there were phases when I was super into chemistry, then I got bored of it and went to an astronomy phase. Then I lost interest in astronomy and got into a phase where I got super into biology. And then I got bored of biology and went into a phase where I got super into physics. Actually, that's not true. I actually hate physics. Like, it's It's way too much math, I don't like it. But my point is, when I went through phases, my interest in those scientific subjects, as I just mentioned, went through peaks and valleys. They didn't just temporarily peak and then I just moved on. I mean, even after I went through a period during my first 2 years of high school where my interest in sciences kind of dropped off, it didn't stay that way. I mean, and I just recently went through a whole new phase of, interest in biological, chemical, and astronomical sciences, largely due to try to counter the scientifically unsubstantiated claims of theists. And that's really what I'm trying to get at. What I'm going through might well be a phase. I don't rule that possibility out. I am extremely passionate about my position, and I'm interested in researching religion, and watching religious debates, and making videos debunking religious claims, and I might be more interested and passionate about all these things that I've ever been about anything in my life so far. It gives me purpose, but it's, also possible that I won't be interested in doing these things forever, and I might just end up going through burnout. But just because I lose interest in talking about and criticizing religion, that doesn't mean I won't gain interest in it again. Just because this phase might end doesn't mean I won't go through another one. And who knows? I mean, I pretty much loved watching cartoons ever since I was a kid. I certainly haven't grown out of that phase. I just, I just started watching some different animations. But my point is, this so-called atheism phase that I'm in has a very good chance of continuing for a very long time. I just like being an atheist and explaining to other people why. Or I guess just shouting into the empty, heartless void of YouTube, hoping that someone will see my content and finally click the subscribe button, please! But, at the same time, I recognize that I'm not going to be the same person I am today a year from now, or 2 years from now, or however many years beyond that. I am a human being, and I change over time. I go through phases. So, you know what, maybe I really am going through a phase, and in a few years, I won't really care much about the stuff that I'm talking about right now, and I'll just be, content to live my life as an atheist without sharing my personal views with anyone. But before I end this video, I just want to give one last allegory. When I was a kid, I loved dinosaurs, and I went through massive dinosaur phases where I, gobbled down every dinosaur book I could, and wanted to learn all the different species and what they ate and when they were alive, and I was just so interested in dinosaur fossils. Then I sort of grew out of that phase, and I never really went back into it again. I'm just not really interested in studying dinosaurs, and I haven't been for a very long time. So, you could say that was a phase of my life that I permanently grew out of. But here's the thing. Just because I grew out of my dinosaur phase doesn't mean I don't believe in the things that I learned while I was in that phase. I don't just now disagree with the fact that dinosaurs once walked the earth and that they were all wiped out 65 million years ago. And it's really the same way with atheism. Even if I grow out of my atheist phase and I don't come back to it, because I simply don't find the subject matter interesting, that doesn't mean I will just not believe the things that I do right now. It doesn't mean I will have this big change of heart and return to Christianity. It doesn't mean that I will look back at myself in the future and say, man, how foolish was I? Just because I might grow out of my atheist phase does not mean I won't still be an atheist. You can never truly know what will happen in the future, but a good way to guess is, to look back into the past. This segment might be kind of weird, and make sure not to take this part totally seriously, but, to represent what I'm talking about visually, this chart I made represents my levels of belief in God throughout the past 18 years of my life. As you can see, I started out as agnostic, as all babies do when they're born, having neither knowledge of theism nor atheism. Then as I grew, I transitioned to a belief in the Christian God as my parents introduced me to it, and my belief reached peak levels as a young child. Then as I grew up, my beliefs gradually started to decline as I began to question more and more of what I was told, and then by the time I got to high school, I was roaming around the area of agnostic. Again, gradually still losing belief in God. Then, by the year of 2019, you see this massive downward trend toward atheism, which of course was brought about because 2019 was the year I really started researching Christianity, and I was actually reading the Bible. Much like the human population, my levels of disbelief in God will likely level off in the future and remain generally stable for the rest of my life, at least so long as, energy and food demands are be able to be met. No, wait, sorry, I think I got a little too sucked into the human population metaphor, shoot. Anyway, to conclude this video, I will answer the question, is my atheism just a phase? Well, maybe, but, from where I'm standing right now, it's really Christianity that seems more like the temporary phase that an ignorant kid went through early in his life, before moving on and leaving that part of him behind. So, here's my question to any Christians who might be watching this video. How do you know that you're not the one who's just going through a phase?